gone into some uncharted territory that I haven't covered in other podcasts.
20 years as a neurosurgeon, and you almost died from meningitis in your brain. Do you feel like there's some sort of correlation between the two?
Near-death experiences are always tailored for the soul who's having them.
I'm here with Dr. Eben Alexander. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule. I know you've been interviewed by the likes of Oprah and Larry King. You've done these huge lectures for people, and here you are in my very, very humble, small podcast, which again just shows that you're not really doing this and speaking about all of this just because you want some sort of fame and glory. You're actually really trying to get a message out, and it seems like even if you hit one person or help influence one person with your message, it's worth it for you to spend an hour of your time.
Well, Chris, you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, what happened to me was an extraordinary set of events, and it certainly gets the scientific community's attention because of the details of my medical case. But there are many out there who would never understand the medical details of that case who can still benefit from my story. And my story is also aligned with the direction that the scientific community is heading now. I mean, the old thinking that I was trained in back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, that the brain creates consciousness, that the physical world is all there is, that existence is birth to death, nothing more. That's pretty much been disproven by modern scientific study of these kind of cases. I'm really not caring how big audiences are, as long as one soul can, find some light and kind of love and harmony in the message that I bring, then good, then it's all worthwhile.
Yeah, from doing my research, that was clear. For me personally, that was a clear narrative with you, which is that you're going to do from A to Z, whatever it is. Your goal seems to be pretty clear, which is to try to influence somebody in a positive way. And that's all that I've gotten from any of your research. But I don't really want to hit on your story like it's been told 1,000 times already. Also, you're an author. You've written several books about it, which I'll get into just a little bit. If someone wants to know your story or hear, rinse and repeat interviews from you, I literally was able to find 30 of them easy peasy. So I want to try to go into questions that I didn't hear or didn't find anybody asking. But let's just to break you down just a little bit to simplify where we're going here. Number one, are you a Hornets fan?
A bit. I had kind of left North Carolina by the time the Hornets came along, and I was actually more of a Celtics fan because I was up in Boston at the time. So, yeah, I like the Hornets. I'm not putting them down, but at that part of my life, I was actually more involved with the Celtics and what they were doing in the 80s and 90s up in Boston.
Good time for the Celtics for sure.
Yeah, it was.
So you were born in North Carolina. You were adopted by your parents, Eben and Elizabeth. You were raised in Winston-Salem. You
Yes.
attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 1975 and the Duke University School of Medicine in 1980. You then went on to teach and practice neurosurgery for 20 years. You worked at the Boston Children's Hospital and the Dana-Farber Institute for Cancer. You spent 15 years at Harvard Medical School. In 2007, you finally met both of your birth parents and birth siblings, which I think is like where I kind of want to start right there before I go into more of the narrative, which is that I grew up with several people who were adopted. I know several people who were adopted, and I know for some people it's a very sensitive subject. But how did that psychologically play into your life? Because I know that there's a lot of people that I know that were adopted that they really had these really hard struggles and battles. When they were finally able to meet their biological parents, it had a really significant impact on them, whether positive or negative. And I'm just wondering, if you can just explain just a tiny bit about being adopted and how that affected you. And
Sure, it's a very important part of my story, so I'm very glad you brought it up, Chris. It turns out that my birth mother was 16 years old, unwed. She was a sophomore in high school, and she had to kind of lie to her friend. She supposedly was off staying with her grandmother, but in fact, she was in a house for unwed mothers down in Charlotte, North Carolina, for 3 months before delivering me in December of '53. And social services took me over at age 11 days, and it was failure to thrive. Some children, they just don't thrive well when they're first born, and especially, I think, if they sense any kind of tension in the family setting. And I know my mother loved me very much and wanted to keep me, but things were just falling apart. So at age 11 days, I was put in the hospital. And that was right around Christmas and New Year's of 53. And when my birth mother thought that she would be able to reclaim me, she found no, that social services wasn't going to let that happen. And yet she was not ready to sign the papers to let me go. And so basically, I languished in that baby dorm for 4 months until she finally did sign the papers. And in mid-April of 54, I was finally adopted. I was adopted into a wonderful, loving family. I mean, I couldn't have been more blessed in that adoption. And I know that my birth mother struggled, that she was basically living in a poverty situation and there was just no way for her to take care of me. So that was all kind of the origin of it all. But I really didn't know anything except for the fact I was adopted. So growing up, the laws in North Carolina were very strict. A lot of the legislators did not want anybody uncovering the pathways from an adoptee back to their birth family. In fact, I knew of cases where the birth dates were actually changed to make it more challenging for somebody to find their true origins. I would write letters to the children's home when I was younger. Any sign of my birth mother out there? Does she want to reconnect? And always get the same answer: no, she's not looking for you, forget about it. So I pretty much gave up on that search in my early 20s. And I was okay with that. Although I think at a deep level, I was still kind of suffering from a kind of a subconscious or unconscious wound of not being good enough for my mother. So not good enough to deserve the love of this universe. So I think that there was a deep struggle. A lot of it was subconscious, but I think it did influence how I interacted with women and other things. Now, another thing that's important to point out is that, like so many others, I was struggling with alcohol very early on in my career. It was never affected my neurosurgical work at all. But on my nights off call, I tended to lean a little too heavily on that scotch. So in 1991, I stopped drinking. And to me, the hardships in life, the hardship would be the adoption abandonment wound and the hardship of having to, actively reject alcohol, which turned out to be in my family history. Of course, I had no way of knowing all that at the time. But those were gifts. I didn't realize that until after my near-death experience in 2008. But the hardships in life, in many ways, are the things that allow us to grow. They serve as catalysts. And for me, the adoption abandonment wound and that struggle with alcohol that led to my stopping drinking forever in 1991 were crucial steps in my life. And I look back at them with tremendous gratitude. And the gratitude is not just that I came to resolution of those problems, but that I had them in the first place, because I think that allowed for a tremendous amount of growth. And a lot of that growth really came together in my NDE. But in terms of the adoption story, it turns out that in the year 2000, and this is all in my book, Proof of Heaven, in the year 2000, my older son, Eben the Fourth, was doing a school project. And it turned out it demanded that we know more about our biological heritage. And I remember him pleading with me, Daddy, you got to reach out to the children's home again. We got to get some better answers to these questions about your birth mother and what happened to her. I thought, all right, we'll do this, but I know I'll get the same answer as always, that there's no contact, so forget about it. But I didn't get that answer. And it's all described in Proof of Heaven. We were driving up to go skiing up in Maine, February of 2000. And I remembered, oh, yeah, the social worker told me to call her that afternoon. She might have some answers. So I called her up and she said, well, I did find something out. Are you sitting down? Well, I was driving through a blizzard to go skiing with my son in the back seat, but I was sitting down. And she said, your birth parents got married. Now, I cannot tell you what a gigantic shock that was to me in February of 2000, because I'd always thought they'd gone their separate ways. I never, ever thought that they'd gotten married. And she said they had a family. They had 3 children. And so I had a full biological family out there that I'd never known about. And I only found that out in February of 2000. But that's when the social worker also said, well, but your youngest sister passed 2 years ago, and they're still grieving her loss. So it's not a good time to come back in their lives. And to me, that was just devastating. And when you study literature on adoption sociologically, to have a rejection from a birth parent, later in life, when you have that big rejection back as an early child, it can really kick you off the cliff. And I didn't know it until months later. I kind of came to realize I stopped taking my sons to church. I stopped saying prayers with them at night. I basically lost any faith I'd ever have had in a loving person of God and the power of prayer with that perceived rejection from my birth mother back in February 2000. And looking back on it now, it all makes perfect sense. But when it was unfolding, it was really tough to go through. And my whole life kind of went into turmoil. My marital relationship, relationships with friends, at work. I mean, all this stuff was kind of tipped over by that perceived rejection. Now, it turned out that the social worker didn't really know that at all. She had to surmise that there were various reasons that my birth family was not ready to reach out again. But that wasn't the case. She actually, there's a much deeper story that we don't have time to go into, but it has to do with the fact that one of my birth sisters had already discovered my identity, 13 years before that. That's a huge story in its own right, but the reality of it is they were never trying to reach out to me. And that sister who had approached my mother, because it was actually a grandmother who had informed the sister that I existed. Imagine you're in a family and your grandmother tells you that that your parents had a sibling before they were married. So maybe you've got a sibling out there in the world. But she never wanted to violate a relationship with me, but she wasn't even sure I existed and wasn't sure my identity. All those things were very kind of challenging and confusing. October 5th of 2007, I finally met my birth parents. I went down a sidewalk in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and to the red door on their house. And
That's amazing.
my mother opened the door, and for the first time in 54 years, I hugged her, and then minutes later, hugged my birth father, and then minutes or that weekend met birth brother and sister who was still alive. We've had a beautiful sense of reunion since that time, getting together with extended family, etc. But the reality is they were still grieving the loss of that sister. And it was only after my coma, when I got a picture of that sister from my other birth sister who was still living, the shocking understanding and realization when I received a picture 4 months after my coma. And all of a sudden, that whole mystery of that beautiful girl in the butterfly wing deep in my near death experience came to a very firm and concrete resolution, proving to me the reality of the whole journey. That's basically what that set of circumstances allowed for me. The rest of the journey has unfolded in a beautiful and powerful way of transformation and understanding. But it was all ultimately about that sense of being loved or not by the universe and whether or not I even deserve to exist, which had been a deep subconscious struggle due to that adoption abandonment wound, but came to an extremely favorable resolution as the events of my NDE and then the months after my NDE, making sense of it all, started to come together.
So yeah, I mean, just to continue along the storyline there, in November 2008, you were diagnosed with bacterial meningitis, which is essentially inflammation of the brain membrane. Am I correct? The membrane around
Well, but mine was a meningoencephalitis. It ended up involving not just the meninges around my brain,
your
but
spinal
causing
cord.
full thickness swelling all the way deep in beyond the gray matter into the white matter, deep in my brain. I mean, it was an should have killed me bacterial meningoencephalitis.
And you suffered, you were taken to the hospital eventually. Again, you've told the story many times so people can find it easily. But you were taken to the hospital. Eventually, you're going into these harsh seizures. Doctors have you on antibiotics. They're giving you a 2% chance to live. I'm just summarizing. Anyway, after pumping you and pumping you with antibiotics, essentially the doctors make a decision to take you off the antibiotics. And
Right.
hours later, you wake up.
Well, but when I was important to get, when I was waking up, my brain was absolutely savaged by this infection. I did not even recognize my mother, my sisters, my sons at the bedside. I had no idea who these beings were. All I knew was where I'd just been, this extraordinary journey. And I still remember the details of that journey as vividly and sharply today as if the whole thing just happened yesterday. So when you say I woke up, you got to
Well, you're
clarify
no
that,
longer in a
wow,
coma.
that brain was wrecked. But
Right.
then I had full recovery over about 2 months.
Yeah, I mean, it was according to medical science, it was a miraculous situation. But anyway, when you wake up from your coma, essentially you don't really know. Like I was going to say, you didn't know what was going on in this reality, but you were recalling NDE, right? You had this whole
Yes.
journey, this whole experience. through the afterlife, which eventually you published a book called Proof of Heaven in 2012,
Right.
describing the experience in detail. So if someone wants to know the full story, that's really the place to go. I read the book. It's very detailed. There's really nothing missing from the storyline there. Here come my real questions now. So it's interesting that 20 years as a neurosurgeon and you almost die from meningitis in your brain. Do
Right.
you feel like there's some sort of correlation between the two?
Well, what I'll tell you is that near-death experiences are always tailored for the soul who's having them. They have no other reason for existing at all. They're not of importance to anyone else from the perspective of the universe. But from the perspective of science, we can study them and study large numbers of NDEs and start to make some conclusions about it. But for a neurosurgeon like me, who is fascinated with the brain-mind connection, the nature of consciousness, who have these issues of my adoption abandonment wound, and then reuniting with my birth family, all of these various kind of pieces of my journey to self-discovery, to have a near-death experience that took me very deep. I mean, one of the ingredients of my NDE that I've never really heard about to such a degree in anyone else's was the amnesia I had. I had no memories of Eben Alexander's life. I had no knowledge of this earth or this universe. It was an empty slate. And I only came to realize in the months and years after my coma why that was so critical. I've found out, especially in a meditative experience 2.5 years post coma, when I finally encountered the soul of my adoptive father, who had passed over 4 years before my coma, but was nowhere to be found in my near death experience. But when I encountered his soul 2.25 years post NDE in deep meditation, it became clear to me why I could not have just seen him and had a standard NDE, because if I had, I would have been more likely to reject it as just, oh, you see who you want to see on the way out. And that's why I had to go an extra level deep in terms of the mystery of my spiritual guidance during the NDE and have it be that beautiful young woman on the butterfly wing. And all of that made far more sense to me as I came to recognize the power of this journey and why it seemed way too real to be real, because it really happened. But as is confirmed in a medical case report on my medical records written by 3 doctors not involved in my care, but fascinated by my recovery. In that case report, they make it clear that my brain was in no shape to have any kind of dream or hallucination, much less the most extraordinary, rich, detailed, kind of memorable spiritual experience I could imagine. And yet it all happened at a time when the medical details of my case, the Glasgow coma scales, features of the neurologic exams, the fact that CT and MRI showed all lobes of my brain affected, make it really impossible to try and explain my phenomenal experience based on conventional neuroscience, because it couldn't have happened according to modern neuroscience. And that's one of the reasons why my case is taken so seriously by the scientific community.
Yeah. In your process of going through your NDE, you really put emphasis on sound. And my interpretation, one, I think you're kind of explaining it in a way that it's a gateway. I've actually heard you, I think I heard you use that word gateway in particular. But the way that I was interpreting it as I was listening to several lectures that you were doing is it was sort of like an elevator to some degree. Can you elaborate on your narrative around sound and how it ties into your NDE?
Yes, well, it's very important. One thing that I knew throughout the NDE was that this perception of sound, frequency, vibration, was very powerful throughout. Every transition in the spiritual realm was accompanied by this profound sense of music and a light portal that was associated with it. My NDE started in what I call the earthworm eye view, a very primitive course, a kind of subterranean, unresponsive realm. Never at any point did I have any body awareness, but I was a speck of observation. I was kind of witnessing things around me. So at that beginning, in that earthworm eye view, it was primitive. Like I said, it was like being in dirty jello. All of that shifted when this slowly spinning white light, it came packaged with what I would call a perfect musical melody. And that replaced the sound that was so dominant in that earthworm eye view, that was mainly kind of a smashing sound like somebody banging on an anvil. But now I had this beautiful musical melody with this light portal that opened up and took me out of that ugly earthworm eye view realm and up into this rich, ultra real Gateway Valley. But I know in that Gateway Valley, there were many Earth-like features, but beauty. It was a world of ideals, kind of like Plato's world of ideals, but for the individual soul. Lovely meadow with thousands of beings dancing in the meadow, and there were children playing and dogs jumping, incredible festivities. And it was all being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs of angelic choirs that were emanating these chants and anthems and hymns that would thunder through my awareness. And this is where the music starts to become more obvious. And again, this is not music you could ever hear with your ears in a four-dimensional space-time. It's an idealized form of music that goes far beyond what we can hear here. In fact, I would say it's the source of music for composers, for musicians. The ultimate source of where they get their stuff is this kind of world of ideals. But the important thing in terms of your question is that the angelic choirs provided, and I will point out while we're in this part of the story, that is where I had this beautiful girl on the butterfly wing who was beside me, my spiritual guide. She never said a word, never had to, because her truth, her deep, profound, emotionally engaging truth, which was so comforting to me in the moment, was delivered telepathically. And the words that I wrote down later to convey that truth: you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You're richly cared for. That was just at the beginning of the journey up beyond that Gateway Valley, because the angelic choirs provided yet another portal. And to understand that, you've got to remember when people describe life reviews, birth, death, everything in between simultaneously presented to you in that realm. That this is the reason that it's so difficult to explain. You're completely outside of Earth time in this general narrative that we normally live our lives by, and in a realm where you can witness all of your kind of soul journey, including past lives and future potentials, etc., from this lofty perspective. But music, vibration, frequency was the way I sensed the pathways between these various levels of the spiritual realm.
When I was researching and going through the narratives, and when I started hearing you talking about sound, something popped up to me, which is that in Genesis, God is speaking, and as God is creating, and God said, "Let there be," right? And I was it kind of connected these dots in that moment where it was like you were talking about sound and how relevant it was, and sound is essentially frequency and vibration and wavelength. And I was wondering, I was like, when God was creating the universe in biblical recollection of it anyway, which I'm
Uh-huh.
not trying to go religious on anything, but I was like thinking, I'm like, when God said, "Let there be," I saw it in such a different light, right? I mean, because the layman will look at it and say God's actually speaking these words, but after taking your interpretation of sound and associating with that, I was like, this is the fundamental wavelengths and vibrational frequency. When it's not God saying do this thing and it's happening,
Right.
actually creating the foundation of wavelength and vibration, which is sound.
Well, and in fact, to support your point even more strongly, and again, this is something else I did discuss in the book Proof of Heaven. But when I came back to this world, I knew that God was a puny little human word with a lot of baggage that, in my view, didn't do justice to even remotely approach the all majesty and power and the sense of deep spiritual oneness with, connection with, that God force that I encountered in the core. And in fact, what I experienced there was this deep, resonant Om sound. And that's what I ended up calling that deity, because I realized that, the petty little discussion of, are we talking about God, Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit? Well, we're all talking about the same thing, but it goes much deeper and richer than a little human being trying to label and own this thing with a religious ideology. And especially when you look at the common ground of near-death experiences across all cultures, and this includes many near-death experiencers who might have formerly been an atheist or agnostic, over 90% of them come back not just believing in, but knowing the reality of a loving personal force at the core of the universe. And so for religious ideologies to try and claim that and own that, you start seeing where they get into trouble, because ultimately they're often trying to control other people. But for individual souls who are trying to come to a deeper understanding of the nature of reality and their sense of meaning and purpose in the universe, and how all of this kind of discussion of such a fundamental kind of God force of love at the core of the universe is related to them, then I would say, you kind of have to leave a lot of the religious ideologies behind, especially where they point to conflict, where they point to being exclusive ideologies. The majority of near-death experiencers, as Bruce Grayson, who's an MD who has studied these cases for 45 years, will tell you, they come back much more spiritual, but less religious. And I think that's very important in our modern and conflicted world. And we just it's up to each and every one of us to kind of open our minds to the possibilities here and become more educated through personal experience of meditating, of centering prayer, these ways of going within. All of us can end up discovering many of these truths that become obvious to near-death experiencers, but we can do it through our own personal experiences. This is why I strongly recommend people get into meditation, centering prayer, any form that you can turn off the little voice in your head.
You talk about this reality and what this reality actually is, the physical embodiment, why we're going through pain, death, suffering, all of these things. But for the layman who's trying to figure things out, what is this world? Why are we here? What's the purpose of this world? Why are we dying? Why are we being born, suffering? All of these things. What is the general consensus there?
Well, you cannot overstate the importance of love and the binding force of love. And this, in many ways, is about, I call it kind of the love of the creator for the creation. But since we're all co-creators with that God force, this is a love that all of us can come to know. So to me, NDEs are showing us something very deep and fundamental about the nature of reality. The fact that life reviews are such a common element of NDEs. And I didn't have an Eben Alexander life review because of my amnesia, but I saw life reviews in two very major visions. But in both of those, I had this tremendous sense of kind of the interwoven nature of our lives and our kind of higher souls growing towards this oneness with the divine. A huge part of this scientific story has to do with reincarnation because the evidence for reincarnation is overwhelming. If you go to uvadops.org, that's the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, you'll find scientists who for more than 6 decades have been studying past life memories in children suggestive reincarnation. And you'll start realizing that this bigger vision of our souls coming back again and again in a process of refinement is all contributing to the evolution of consciousness itself. So ultimately, this deep lesson of love, seeing the fact that we are eternal souls, that we don't die with the death of a physical body. In fact, our conscious awareness can be greatly expanded at the time of bodily death. And most importantly, that our relationships with others are what allow for this growth, this teaching and learning and transformation and evolution of all consciousness throughout the cosmos is actually occurring as a process of this kind of awakening and enlightenment that I think is coming to the world. And that's why it's so important to point out that, religions have had thousands of years to teach these lessons like the golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated, which is right at the center of life reviews. Because at the end of your life, when your life flashes before your eyes, you have to feel what it was like to dish out whatever you've been dishing out to people for your whole lifetime. So life reviews have been gently nudging us towards loving each other, taking care of each other. And this involves not just humans, but animals too. So there's a lot more to this big story of understanding of this connectedness of mind. And that's where I think all of this is headed. But it really has to do with that sense of love and coming to a deeper understanding of ourselves and who we are. And it's not just that little ego self. The ego self presents often like in addictions and things like that, but we have higher soul and we can access that through nature, through meditation, centering prayer, all these ways of coming into the soul we truly came here to be.
You definitely hit on a couple of terms that are in one of my questions. You're speaking about receiving a life review judged by your higher soul, both things you've mentioned so far. You also, I've heard you speak about soulmates and soul groups, essentially connecting to this higher soul, this individual higher soul, right? So it seems like from my understanding around your NDE, there's actually like a hierarchy. There's actually a system, a ladder, where we down here in this physical world are we at the bottom of the ladder here? Like
Well,
doing the grunt work, if you will?
I would say this is kind of the very densest kind of vibratory frequency. So in a sense, we're kind of at the bottom of it. But then, given my entire journey, I would even go as far as to say my earth or my view was an even more primitive, down and dirty level than the material realm. But that's why people can kind of dive into apparent purgatories, things that they might interpret as hell. Although I would say that from my perspective, there's no such thing as an eternal hell or damnation. That would make absolutely no sense. That any soul was completely condemned to zero growth. I think that all souls have potential for growth. So, but anyway, you could debate where exactly what's the hierarchy of these levels. But yes, there are multiple levels involved with the spiritual realm, and our material realm is way down near the bottom of that whole stack.
So when you're saying the term higher self, because a lot of people use that term, no one really has a definition for it. I feel like it's a term that's used just to oversimplify and underexplain spiritualism. But when you're saying the higher soul, which is judging you, which is giving you your life review, it's almost like being your own boss, no, to some degree, like being
It
self-employed.
is.
And
Well, it's a part of you that largely resides in the subconscious, that is kind of marking these lessons as we go. Higher soul, I think it's important to specify. It makes no real sense to talk of your higher soul or my higher soul because our higher souls are actually interconnected. And that's where you start getting into where people discuss like an oversoul or kind of that God force, that God mind, that in many ways is a repository for growth and transformation. But it's the growing happens through our actions here. That I think is an important thing to stress. And that's why it's so critical that people get that, committing suicide is not the right idea, to escape the conditions and situations of this life. Because ultimately, unless you can resolve everything in a life review, committing suicide just repackages the challenges of this life for the next incarnation. So
so essentially, to simplify it, your best bet here in this world is number one, understanding that whatever you're dishing out, you're going to have to experience that in the afterlife in your life review. Uh, if you hurt somebody, and a question I also had is, what about unintentional things? Like, let's just say that nowadays we live in this world where some people are what I would call unreasonable, and can be offended by things that are really not offensive, let's just say. So let's just say that I'm interacting with somebody and they seem to be offended by something that's not offensive. My intention there was not to offend, but because they're overly sensitive, let's just say, or hypersensitive, they're offended by something. Is that something that I would be subjected to in a life review?
no, I don't. That's way too much kind of in the ego wrestling territory. Where they have some ego weakness where something that you say that shouldn't bother them bothers them. Well, that's more of a struggle that they're going to have at these lowest levels. And certainly narcissists, sociopaths, ego gone berserk. We see plenty of that in our society. And that's not what I'm talking about here, but those things contribute because of what those people do reflect a kind of a low level of soul growth that's requisite. And sadly, if a narcissist goes through his whole life and never, ever makes any progress in acknowledging his narcissism, then in his life review, he's going to
So,
see how crappy all that stuff was that he handed out to others. So, in that sense, it does make some sense. But this is all about souls contributing to their growth and to the growth of fellow souls through the binding force of love, through mutual support, through this kind of unconditional heart love, through trying to appreciate as much as possible that souls are doing their best to try and come to a deeper understanding. And the more we can do to help each other along this pathway, that kind of thing can be favorably reflected in the life review. But certainly if your ego has gone amok and narcissism, sociopath, what have you, behavior has ruled your life, that all is going to be reflected in a life review that will then hopefully nudge you in a better direction for the next lifetime, because we certainly do learn and do some course correction in these life reviews. I mean, there's no question that's their reason for being.
I guess it
But
leads me to the next question there, which is that, like, is there a way out of this reincarnation cycle, or are you just are we just as these sparks of soul just grunt workers, and we don't really get to earn our way out of this cycle?
I would say it's very worthwhile because what happens is as the soul becomes more and more liberated from the shackles of the ego mind and becomes much more aligned with kind of the oversoul and the one soul, when the soul is kind of getting into Mahatma Gandhi or Mother Teresa or Martin Luther King kind of territory or the Dalai Lama. Those souls are very advanced, very into the higher good, helping others. From my perspective, they might well graduate to some level that we don't even know yet because it's beyond human conception. But the bottom line is this is not a blind mechanistic wheel of suffering where your goal is to simply climb off of it at the earliest possible stage. It's a very rewarding journey of transformation and evolution of mind and consciousness to a higher level.
Right. Well, what do you think the actual purpose of that is? Is again, if we're in the process of refining sparks of our soul and trying to elevate that to the higher soul, which is then taking all that information in, right? It's a collective consciousness. But why not? If God is creating us and we are being kind of put in this base level where we have to learn and grow and build and cultivate, what do you think is essentially the real purpose of that? Why not just create a being who is already elevated enough where they don't have to go through this very, very detailed process?
Well, I think it's because God would be very bored with a predetermined world where everything was absolutely crystal clear and perfect from the start. That it would be, in this perfect, loving environment. Well, I think for whatever variety of reasons that to me look pretty sensible, it's a dynamic world. It's an interesting world of change and of discovery and of understanding and of learning and teaching.
Yeah.
And I would subscribe basically to Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the French paleontologist who wrote The Phenomenon of Man back in the mid 20th century. He was a scientist, paleontologist, so he studied science over a billion-year time cycles. He was also a Jesuit priest. And at the time, there were all these huge discussions about Darwinian evolution. And he recognized, yeah, there's an evolution going on, but he also saw it was much bigger than just biological systems on Earth. And he postulated the evolution of all consciousness. Evolution of higher mind and of the God soul is nothing more than individual sentient beings coming to a deeper understanding of their own kind of meaning and purpose for existence, as well as their relationships with their fellow beings and what that instructs them about the nature of this universe. So it just gives us a much bigger, richer, deeper, broader kind of purpose and sense of meaning and understanding of our lives and how they interact with others. That's what I see as kind of the goal of this entire kind of enterprise.
Yeah. Well, I have two questions left for you before I know you have to jump off, but my one question that I had was, so let's just say we're going into this life review now, and in the life review there are things that, religious perspective, there's something called repentance, right? So I'm in this life, I did something, I hurt somebody, I was cruel to somebody to some degree. Is there rectifying that here in this world, or no matter what I do here in this world, I still have to go through that in the life review?
Well, as my partner Karen says, do a daily review. I mean, she is not a fan of saving all this stuff up. You're exactly right. The life review is only there as a course correction after your life, after this particular life has been lived. And of course, for NDEers, it's not over yet. So the life review is instructive to allow them to come back to this world and do a better job, essentially, of loving others, of focusing on the higher good. But I'd say ultimately that's what all of this is about. Pinker, I think at Harvard wrote a book not long ago about how many things in this world are getting better. Like the level of violent crime over the last 40 years. There's much less property crime and violent crime in North America than there used to be. There are far fewer battlefield deaths, even though the recent tragedies in Ukraine and the Middle East are starting to kind of put a notch to reverse that. But there's been an overall trend in humanity for at least the last half century of improvement in our overall situation with more kind of loving actions and people taking care of each other. You wouldn't necessarily know that from the political polarization of our era, but if you actually map out the statistics, we seem to be getting healthier as a society. And I would say that this awakening that we're talking about is going to be a major exclamation mark or catalyst to help in continuing the progress of that improvement. But a lot of it, I think, is going on in the background in the form of, say, life reviews of people who are coming back to this world and realizing that that kind of reckless kind of treating others, in ways we wouldn't like to be treated is no longer the best way to live our lives. So I think that gently, this awakening, this revolution in understanding is starting to shift our planet at large and to make us a much more harmonious and kind of civil society.
Do you think that there's actually some sort of guidebook here that dictates what's right versus wrong? Since does seem to be kind of speculative to some degree, what's right versus what's wrong.
I think it boils down to what feels good. Again, golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated. That very rule is written into the fabric of what you see unfolding in life reviews studied in a scientific fashion over the last many decades.
What if
So
you're a
they're
masochist?
teaching. Sorry?
What if you're a masochist?
Well, I think a masochist is trying to learn something different about physical pain.
Well, if they're
Uh,
treating people the way they want to be treated, then do you see where I'm going with that?
I see where you're going, but I think that's the interesting thing is kind of it's almost like there's not a rule book other than we like to be treated nicely. Now, I'm not sure exactly how to entertain your question on the masochist. I mean, most of us are not masochists. I think that much is fair to say.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think a masochist is basically experimenting with kind of different modalities of being alive. A masochist sometimes is doing that because to actually feel more alive involves active physical sensation, which they're best able to generate as a sensation of pain. So they're doing that maybe for different reasons than a lot of others of us would be doing such a thing. But I think in a life review, they still would probably not be confused about mistreating others to the point of discomfort and kind of terrifying and irritating others to using pain as a way to feel yourself as being alive. The life review would be a way of kind of sorting through what is done for higher good and what is something that hurts others. It's an interesting question. And I'll keep that in mind doing further research because I haven't paid particular attention to masochism as a phenomenon, but it is an interesting question how that might kind of influence the life review of that higher soul.
Yeah. And I guess the last question that I have here really is that so it what is it that I should be doing? Let's just say I'm a layman person. I'm not really the best person in the world. I want to be a better person. I want to be a spiritual person, but really who I am is not the nicest person in the world. But I want to do my diligence. Can you fake it till you make it to some degree? Or is it also based off of your consciousness and your thoughts, where it's like this person across from me is like really driving me nuts, and I'm judging them in my head, but while I'm doing that, I'm being outwardly nice to them. Is there a correlation between that?
Well, I think so. I mean, I think there's from my perspective, a huge kind of karmic linkage between what you kind of see in a life review and how you adjust your life versus what you've been handing out to others. And I think to get back to your question, it's really about just trying to live your life, trying to very simply share love and kindness, random acts of kindness, seeing if people need help, asking if they're okay. Taking care of others is a plenty good thing to be doing in this lifetime. Meditation and prayer are great to kind of get a bigger picture and kind of a personal journey element to this. But ultimately, it's about what we do with every breath of being in our waking state in these bodies, interacting with our fellow beings. It's really just trying, to be that higher soul that's here to help others.
Yeah.
And I think that ultimately, when we do that, it kind of shifts our inner perspective. And the whole outer world, in many ways, is a reflection of our inner world. And the more we serve as a conduit for love and kindness, compassion, mercy, and acceptance, and when necessary, forgiveness in our dealings with our fellow beings, I think the more the universe starts to gift us with that kind of harmony and peace and power of living in that kind of helpful situation focused on the higher good. So to me, all of it kind of tends to kind of adjust the flow of your consciousness and your focus in life. And ultimately, I think that meditating an hour or two a day has been a tremendous boon to me. And I would highly recommend that people take a little time to go inside and take a break from the kind of ego mind and its kind of demands and stresses of living these lives, and learn that we're more than that, and then start to connect more with that higher soul and that primordial mind.
Well, that was really great advice. I think that's a great place to end it. Again, Dr. Alexander, thank you so much for taking an hour out of your life to do this with me. And I appreciate everything that you're saying and doing. Again, it's really amazing. And again, thank you for giving people who have smaller podcasting or smaller audience a chance to interview you. So thank you for
My pleasure, Chris. And you've gone into some uncharted territory that I haven't covered in other podcasts. So very good job doing that. And thanks for getting this out to the world. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander.